Another live. Sorry, I'm a little late. I was trying to figure out how to get my camera or my phone positioned so that I could read comments. So I don't really have an agenda. I'm mostly here for question and answers. So if you guys have questions, just go ahead and I'm fixing my hair. Go ahead and type them in the chat. I'm not that fancy today because, quarantine, I'm home all the time. But I did put on makeup, which is better than most days. So I have this group that I'm forming. You can absolutely ask questions about that. And if you just have general questions about wildlife biology careers, or I don't know, you can ask me anything. I'll do an AMA. But really the focus is wildlife biology careers. Of course my kitty wants to come up. This is Leo. And if nobody has questions, then I will just sit here and rant. No, I'll give you some of my background and tell you the premise behind my group, why I think it is so needed. It is so necessary. Leo says, hi. Leo always sits on my lap. It's honestly super annoying, but it is when I want it, it's really nice, but other times it's super annoying. But so I am, and Pickles is squeaking toy in the background. So I have recently shifted my career slightly. I was in a postdoc, which was research-based, but it did have education component in it. I was working with teachers on citizen science. So the data that we were collecting, now he's scared. The data we were collecting was real, but the goal was to integrate it into classrooms so that kids could learn science while they're doing science. Hi, Emma. But so I had a long-term postdoc. It lasted 5 years, which is unusually long for a postdoc. Usually postdocs are like max 2 years. And I loved my postdoc so much that I wanted to stay in it as long as possible. But anyway, so I switched my career since February, so I have been starting up my business, Fancy Scientist, and I really started it because I realized I loved science communication, and I didn't know you could make a living by blogging and being an online entrepreneur. I just had no idea about that world. So I'm getting there. I'm trying to make a living, but I'm not there yet, but you can. So anyways, I've been doing this and I really wanted to make my focus conservation and reaching more of the everyday person, reaching non-scientists. But I was blogging about my experiences on the job market because I was just really shocked by how difficult it was to find a job. I knew that academia was competitive, but I had no idea that these other jobs were competitive. And I never wanted to go into academia. I always said, I am not going into academia. So that blog post was really popular and I started blogging more about it and those became really popular. I somehow joined the Wildlife Science Network Facebook group, and there's a Wildlife Workers Network group. So if you're interested in wildlife biology, I highly recommend you join those two Facebook groups. They're really helpful. And I saw all these posts from people who were just asking like general advice. They're like, what should I do next? So an example that I actually screenshot was this woman was asking if she should invest $30,000 in an environmental policy master's. And she she wanted to get a job, and I believe it was I think it was the federal government in wildlife management. And I have been on the job market on and off since 2013. I graduated in 2012 with my PhD, and then I had a short postdoc there. And I can tell you that, I mean, those are two different fields completely, environmental policy and wildlife management. They're two completely different fields. So one, it's not going to help you. Two, if you were doing a research master's or PhD, I don't know if you can do a non-research PhD in the sciences, but you should get paid, actually. So they waive your tuition, and you are paid either to just conduct research as a research assistant. That's usually pretty rare in the ecology, conservation, wildlife biology fields. But usually they have you become a teaching assistant, and that is how you get paid. Now, you won't get paid a lot. Actually, though, where I went to graduate school in Columbia, Missouri, our biology program was pretty well paid, and I had a fellowship. And when I say well paid, we're talking, the fellowship was $21,000 a year. But Columbia, Missouri was such a cheap college town that it was extremely livable. So those are the kinds of things that I want people to avoid, these kinds of decisions, because I mean, she'd be wasting $30,000 because she'd be getting an education for a career that she doesn't want. Okay. So we do have a question from Natty. Hello. As an undergraduate, if I had to choose between the environmental studies major and a biology major, hold on, comments are disappearing, that virtually offers the same classes, which major do you think would complement wildlife biology more? So I would say, okay, so what is your end goal? What do you want to be? And that's what this whole beta group is about, is figuring out exactly what you want your end job to be and then reverse engineering it. At the undergraduate level, I personally don't think your degree matters a whole lot. If you want to go to, well, definitely if you want to go to graduate school, you just have to make sure you get all the qualifications. It's really your combination of the degree and experience that's important. So no matter which decision you make, I would then make sure you get experience for the field that you want to go in. Nobody, or at least when I graduated, I did graduate in 2003, and then I went to graduate school in 2006, and I had a degree in biological sciences. I had a BA, not a BS, so I didn't have a Bachelors of Science. And people just didn't seem to care about that. It was more about my experience. Your grades do matter because that's what you have to get into programs. And then you have to have certain classes. But in my graduate program, there were people who had Russian majors. Now, of course, they had to go back to school and take some additional classes. But because they had that combination of experience and they got the right classes, they were okay. So I would consider cost. And if it's all the same classes, I don't think it matters much. I'm not sure how people feel about virtual degrees. That is something that you would have to do some research on by contacting some jobs that you're interested in working for and seeing what they say. Just contacting, they usually give a contact information, call them and just pretend you're applying for the job. I'm interested in applying for the job and I have a virtual degree from, or just say the university's name. And like, am I a good fit? Should I apply to this? Okay. Oh yeah. Getting a master's with an RA for ecology and evolution, feeling happy about finding that opportunity. I agree. So I had a fellowship, so I didn't have to TA for 4 years. I didn't have to be a teaching assistant for 4 years. The only problem with that is that if you want to teach at all, so I never wanted to go into academia, mostly for R1 because I thought it was just like way too stressful. But say you wanted to pivot and go into teaching, you really want to consider taking an education course if they have a science education course, and also TAing if you can for that experience, because you're not going to be competitive for those teaching jobs. Like a couple of my friends, they work at universities, they're called R2, and they emphasize teaching over research. So they have a heavier teaching load, and they really look for that experience. You're going to have to write teaching philosophies for those types of jobs. And I was pretty lost. I did apply for a couple of jobs like that, and I was pretty lost in applying. Do you think a research master's is a good choice if I want to become a project manager for a wildlife biology project? I think so, but what I recommend, so I created this, it's really just a spreadsheet, but it's called the job tracker. And basically what you do is you look at the job boards now and look at all of the jobs that you're ultimately interested in. So not the ones that you think you can get, like the next step, like the high level position. So find your ultimate like project manager job and find several of them, and then put them in the job tracker and see what kind of experience you need. Or you could even look up people in positions that you want to have. So say if you wanted to work for a state agency, I could look up a state agency wildlife biologist here in North Carolina, and you can look at their experiences. A lot of places have at least selected publications, but they should at least list their degree. So I think in the manager positions, they vary too. So it depends on what kind of manager you're going to be. Some of them that I've looked at seem more people management. Some of them seem more like dealing with well, I guess that's people too, but dealing with stakeholders and creating connections across a landscape. So it really depends on what kind of project manager you want to be. Any tips for applying for graduate school for a master's? If you're going for a research master's, you have to get an advisor to take you on first. I kind of knew that when I was applying, but I didn't fully realize it, and I took some risk and just tried to apply for some graduate programs where I was interested in a professor, and then I just applied and hoped maybe that professor would be interested in me. But really, you want to contact professors. So you can do this several ways, and I go in my book coming out this fall, I go into details about it. So you can go to Texas A&M University's job board site, and they have a list of research assistantships. So you can apply for ones that already exist. So that means that a professor got a grant, and their funding allowed for a master's position or a PhD position, and you would apply for that. Otherwise, you have to contact a professor and make sure that they're interested in taking you on, because the way our field works, there has to be enough room in the lab, and the professor also has to find funding for you. So they're not always willing to take you on, and you're going to waste a lot of time applying for and money graduate school without a professor to take you on. So cold contact them ahead of time, do your research on what kind of professors you're interested in, and establish a relationship and see if they're wanting to take you on. It may even take a couple of years. And the other thing, get as much experience as you can. Get experience in, really, ideally you want to get experience in the things that you ultimately want to do. But if you have no experience, just, if you can, volunteer to try getting your foot in the door. My first volunteer position was working in a flower beetle lab on sexual selection, which has nothing to do with conservation. It did have to do with ecology, but just get your foot in that door, that first step. And then later, that lab helped me get my job at Disney World. I worked at the Animal Tracking Center doing hormone studies. So I had previous lab work, and that was definitely helpful for me. Okay, let's see if we have any other questions. How helpful is a GIS certificate in wildlife conservation work? Is it necessary for conservation positions? Again, I would look at the jobs that you're interested in. Across the whole, I would say that, I mean, GIS is definitely a desirable skill in wildlife conservation. If you are going into wildlife conservation research, I was always interested in conservation, but conservation is a huge, broad field. And what I found from applying to conservation jobs is that so many of the jobs are in fundraising, development, outreach. There's not as much research positions. There is a lot of GIS work in the government, so I would definitely take a look at those jobs and just see if they require a GIS certificate. You can call the hiring manager and see like if that's something that they're looking for. But I would look in the job description to see how important GIS is. There's in the government, there's actually a lot of like strictly GIS only jobs, so you can go that route if GIS is something you're really interested in. So you could work for, I think the USGS has a lot of GIS jobs, but it's definitely helpful. But I don't know what the certificate is going to cost you. If it's going to cost a lot of time and or money, then really research the jobs to make sure that it would help you, because otherwise you waste time and money. But if it's kind of like a free thing that you can do, I mean, it's definitely not going to hurt you. And if you're doing research, you probably will use GIS in your research. For my master's, I literally went door knocking to meet professors to see which professor had funding and would be a good match with my experience. Yeah, I had no idea what I was doing, and we had the internet back then when I was applying to graduate school, but it wasn't like what it is today. So I bought this gigantic book, and I just looked at like of all the universities in the United States. And I just looked at all the different universities and I first looked up, I think, like animal behavior programs and wildlife programs. And then I looked up ecology and biology program. I think I ended up looking at every university in the United States. Yeah, so it's going to take a lot of cold contacting professors. If you're in undergrad, they usually have, your university should have departmental seminars. That's a good way to try to figure out what kind of research you're interested in and meet professors. And if you're a very savvy undergrad, and especially if you volunteer in a lab, you should be able to get to know a professor well and see if like somehow you can get involved in, actually it probably wouldn't work. Well, if you're at a school with graduate students, I don't think they would let you be part of the committee. But if you're in an undergraduate only school, they might let you be part of it. But usually universities have a wildlife society chapter. I highly recommend joining that. I didn't know about it. I don't even think my school offered it. But I highly recommend joining that. And a lot of times they bring in speakers. So that's a great way to meet people. You can get on a committee, and then you can request speakers that you're interested in working with in graduate school and form that relationship with them early on. And then it's much easier to approach them. I am still an undergrad and possibly considering graduate school. Yes. My recommendation for graduate school, again, is just to really look at the jobs you want now, or that you ultimately want. Look at them now, because what happened to me is I was overqualified. I ended up being overqualified for a lot of the jobs that I wanted. So I went to graduate school. I didn't know if I wanted to get a master's or a PhD. I was on the fence. And I actually I got into 2 different programs. One, the professor encouraged me to get a master's first. And the other one, you could just jump straight into PhD. So that's another thing you can do. I think for wildlife, it's kind of rare that happens. This was in the biological sciences department. But I always figured if I didn't like the PhD, then I could change to a master's. And I actually considered that. I considered quitting because I got really frustrated at one point. But I was so far into my PhD that I felt like I finishing it to get a master's would have taken about the same amount of work. So I got a PhD, but what happens is you can be overqualified for jobs. So I used this example in my webinar that I talked about for the program, but I applied to a mammologist position at the North Carolina Wildlife Resources Agency, and I didn't even get an interview for that. And so they asked for someone with a master's. I didn't get an interview. And I found out that is the exact reason why, because when you might be thinking, oh, they have a PhD, they're going to get a lot of bang for their buck. But a lot of times they worry about PhDs taking the job temporarily until they find another job. So having a PhD for master's level job actually can be a disadvantage to you. And in the cover letter, you really, 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 really have to emphasize, like, this is a real job. You really want that. And I really did that. And there were still a lot of jobs that I didn't get because I was overqualified, or a lot of jobs I wasn't interviewed for. I did have some that I was interviewed for that required only masters. One job I remember I applied for, this was a science communication position, and it was at a university. And the person on the hiring committee said to me, "You have the CV of an associate professor. Why in the world would you want this job?" So they're very suspicious of you when you are applying to jobs you're overqualified for. So I personally think it's best to get your master's first. And I actually have a whole blog post and YouTube video about this. And if you guys, I'm just rambling now at this point. If you guys, I think we're all caught up with questions. If you guys have more questions, just post them in there and I'll get to them. So masters, I can't talk. When I feel like I didn't really know what science was until I went to graduate school and had a PhD project. And I think master's students feel the same way too, because when you're a master's student or PhD project, you have a project that is yours. It is your baby. When you are volunteering as an undergrad, or even have technician positions, I graduated. I had 3 internships in between, and they were just like work. They're called internships, but I worked in research labs. I worked in research. You were always doing someone else's part of their work. So you will have somebody tell you what to do, essentially. They will say, run these samples. Even if it's your own undergraduate project, I guarantee they took a lot of time to set up the project for you so that it's a doable chunk for you. A lot of times undergraduates, they are encouraged to present posters or to wrap up a project in a semester. So the professor or the graduate student will make sure that it is, like I said, a doable project, something you can do in a semester. And real science is not like that at all. It takes years for ecologists, it takes years to collect data. It can take years to publish. So, and you're going through the process from start to finish too. That's another thing. You do this more so with a PhD than a master's. So with a master's, you might come in with a specific question, but as a PhD, you should be developing one part of the research completely on your own. So you might come in as part of a grant and have to ask certain questions in your research, but you should at least have a part that you develop on your own. And that was what I really struggled with, and what school, like traditional school, doesn't teach you, even college, because you're always told what to do. So you don't have to think through the problems. And then if you have a problem with your samples or something isn't working, you can let go of that. Like that's up to the graduate student that you're working under, or the lab manager, or the PI to figure out. So it really wasn't until I went to graduate school that I understood what science was like. I don't remember why I'm telling you this, but I am. So where am I going with this? Yeah, so in undergrad, at least when I was in undergrad, I still feel like a lot of it is like this too. You are taught that science is a series of facts to memorize. It's key concepts like an ecology class, you know, the predator-prey cycle and stuff like that. But really being a scientist is asking and answering questions. If you are a research scientist, that is all that it's about. And in school, I really wanted to please the teachers. I wanted to get good grades. So as I got older, I didn't ask questions. I just wanted to try to get the right answer. And I lost that. Like kids, they're always asking questions. Like parents talk about how annoying their children are when they're asking, why this, why that, why that. And my husband's really good at that too. But I lost that curiosity. And really, to be a good scientist, you have to look at the world and be like, why does that tree have pointing leaves? I'm just looking at my trees right now. Or why are these leaves eaten and not these leaves? Or I wonder what's doing that. Like, you have to have that sort of mentality, and then it's really about figuring out the answers. And there's different types of research. Again, for those of you who are joining who are new, you can just ask questions. I'm just rambling at this point right now because I answered the questions so far. So there's two different types of research. There is theoretical research and there is applied research. And theoretical research is really advancing knowledge for knowledge's sake. So my PhD research, I studied forest elephants. I investigated their sociality. I basically watched the elephants and saw who they hung out with. You could identify the individuals. And I collected their dung to see if they were related or not and what type of relationship all of them had together across the population. So this was really a theoretical question. It was looking at the social structure of forest elephants, and I was comparing it to the social structure of African savanna elephants and Asian elephants. That being said, something that I found might be important for conservation in the future, for example, in African savanna elephants, their groups are really important for their overall fitness. So how many babies they reproduce and how long they live. So these groups are really important. So knowing the social structure is really important, but it doesn't directly apply to conservation. It's more like that knowledge is helpful. Okay, I'll come back to research and applied if there's no more questions, or theoretical versus applied, but I have a question. Okay. Did I ever do an unpaid internship? Kind of. I did. So I studied abroad in Kenya for a summer semester when I was in undergrad. And they had this internship available at the study abroad program. Basically, they have a bunch of interns and they have one American intern and they have one American staff member. The rest are Kenyan. So I loved Kenya so much. I really wanted to do this internship. And I had to pay for half of my airfare, and then I was paid in Kenyan salary. So essentially I went the whole year really without getting paid. My food was taken care of, my room and board was taken care of. So I didn't go into debt or anything, but I didn't make money that year. Unpaid internships, I don't know what the answer is, because I totally understand that it excludes people from entering this field some people just can't do it. They got to make money. They don't have the time to do it. But really, experience is what helps you in this field. I hate to say it, but it really is what's important. And I don't really have any advice around it. Just try to find paid internships and keep trying. but I know it's really competitive right now. So that's just kind of a negative thing that's going on with our field, and it's really an institutional, systematic problem that needs to be solved. And from our standpoint, it's also difficult because I've definitely accepted undergrads to volunteer in my lab because I could use the help. And if there's people out there who want to volunteer their time and get experience, and I have work to do, that's the choice that I made. But there are some people out there who do not offer volunteer positions. They only offer paid positions because of the exclusion factor. But what I wanted to say about a scientist is that we don't have a lot of money. Grants are really competitive, and that's how we pay for people, is by getting grants. So yeah, if we don't have the grants, then we can't hire people. Okay, I know I want to go into animal conservation, but I'm unsure what specifically I want to do or what jobs I want to apply for. So I think you would be perfect for this group that I am organizing, because we are going to spend a lot of time working on exactly that, like figuring out yourself. I think a lot of people think this will be like an overview of all the different jobs out there, and there definitely will be that element of it. But I really want you to dive deep within yourself and answer questions that help you figure out what you like to do. Because I was the same way as you. I really wanted to go into conservation. I just wanted to do conservation. But that being said, there's not a whole lot of jobs in animal conservation directly. So as I mentioned before with the nonprofits, if you look at WWF, WCS, so it's World Wildlife Fund, Wildlife Conservation Society, Conservation International. Those are the major conservation organizations. There's fewer research positions than there are financial positions, like fundraising, or just being like a financial planner. There's a lot of like development positions. There's education positions, outreach positions, lawyer positions. So you can work in conservation in a lot of different ways. And working, if you say you want to work with animal conservation and you feel like you definitely need to work with animals, like I said, there's very few positions like that. So the reason why is because a lot of the animals we study with technology. So you are going to be working with the data and not the animals themselves. So like if you think about Jane Goodall, what she did, or even what I did for graduate school, I went out and I studied elephants and I looked for them and I observed them. But that job doesn't really exist, with the exception of like a couple of positions in like the Amboseli research team in Kenya. The higher you go with your degree, the more likely you are going to be analyzing data and writing papers, because they can train people to go to the field to do behavioral observations. A lot of WWF and WCS jobs are international, and field positions are going to hire locals because they know more about the local environment. They can communicate with the people. So if you're looking to work on gorillas, lions, and elephants, you really should do your research now as to what types of jobs are available. For animal conservation research, I would look into organizations like the Nature Conservancy, obviously the government jobs as well. And what I found from looking at those jobs is a lot of conservation jobs are really about like program management and working with stakeholders. Or if they do deal directly with animal research, a lot of times you're doing it indirectly. So you're doing vegetation surveys, things like that. But I was gonna say something and then I lost it. So figure out like why you want to go into conservation. So for me, I switched to science communication because I felt like my research was not having that much of an impact. I would produce a paper, it would go out into the world, and I would find some cool knowledge about forest elephants, but they're getting slaughtered for ivory. They're being poached like crazy. So no matter how much work I could do on forest elephants, unless the poaching stopped, it wouldn't really matter. So I felt like I had more of an impact by trying to communicate these important issues, and especially with kids, because if kids get interested in nature at an earlier age, then they're more likely to grow up as conservationists. And I liked doing that. Like when I was thinking about, as I got in my career and the things that I like to do, I always really struggled with data analysis, and I never really liked it. And I remember going to this one talk from a scientist, and she said, like her dream weekend was on a Saturday morning and like opening up a spreadsheet full of data. Like she loved that. And I was like, that is not me. I'm very glad I got my PhD and I did my whole research career. I'm very thankful for that, and I loved what I did. But again, it just trained for very few jobs. So honestly, I'm really only competitive for elephant jobs abroad. So I would have to move to Africa or Asia, or a few zoo positions here in the United States. There's just not that many. Even if like I was applying for an elephant curator position at a zoo, I would not be competitive because it's a completely different field. So if you need to look at animals, like you want to like be working with primates and looking at elephants, honestly, exploring zoo careers is a better option. Because like I said, and everything is remotely done now too. So I've been working with camera traps. We set up all these camera traps. We're not watching the animals anymore. We're getting the data in directly. And as technology advances, we're doing more and more of that. I just want to see if there's any more questions. I don't think there's more questions, but it would be amazing if scientists have to rely solely on grants for their research. Agree that the way the system sets up leads to exclude people who can't afford to do. Yes. So it totally excludes people. It's a huge problem because on one hand, we're supposed to encourage women and minorities to enter this field, but if they can't afford to do it, then it is, they're stuck. They can't get into the field. So we have this diversity problem, but we also have a barrier to this. So I do know the National Science Foundation is creating programs that particularly attract or that are particularly designed for minority students and women. But the National Science Foundation doesn't care about wildlife management. They don't care about conservation. So unless that stuff is embedded into a theoretical question that is awarded to a professor, you are not going, or there's just fewer of those opportunities. That's what I'm trying to say. Sorry, I'm reading and getting distracted at the same time. So it's a very complicated system, and this has all changed somewhat recently. So again, if you think of Jane Goodall and Diane Fossey in the 70s, and Cynthia Moss, she's the one who studied elephants, they got to just go to the field and watch animals and describe the behavior that they saw, and that was their thesis essentially. But now, in order to get a grant from the big grants from NSF, the National Science Foundation, you have to have it set in a theoretical context. So again, if you're interested in studying and saving forest elephants, there has to be some sort of theory behind it. You can't just say, I want to study them to protect them. There are grants there are smaller grants for direct conservation projects, like National Geographic has smaller grants, and the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service actually has smaller grants for endangered species around the world. But a lot of those times, those grants go to people who are not even necessarily doing science. So I applied, when I was in graduate school, I was awarded a grant from the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service from their elephant program. And some of the other grants were just like to fund to fund poachers, not to fund poachers, to fund rangers on the ground. So like literally their whole grant would be like, we're starting an educational program and we're paying rangers salaries. So there might be some science in terms of like testing the educational program out, but we know that rangers on the ground works. And it makes sense. Elephants are being poached and we need people on the ground to stop that. And if there's no elephants in the future, our science isn't going to matter because the species doesn't exist anymore. Getting a zoology minor in my undergrad, so hopefully that helps. Yes, I don't think your undergrad degree really matters. Now, take that with a grain of salt. Again, look at the jobs that you want, because depending on what kind of position you want and where you want to work, it might matter. And I'm specifically thinking about state agencies. I do think that they care if you get your degree in wildlife biology or wildlife management. If you're applying for master's levels positions, usually state agencies, they have fewer PhD program or positions. Most of their positions are bachelor's and master's level. So if you're already graduated, but you're looking at master's programs and you want to work for a state agency, then I would get into a wildlife biology program or wildlife management program, because I do think that they really care about that. But for other careers, like I said, I was in biological sciences, and I found out late that I wanted to become a wildlife biologist. So my university was terrible for ecologist, wildlife biology. We only had we had ecology class and a tropical marine ecology class. Those were the only two classes I took even remotely related to my field. The other classes I took were physiology, developmental biology, cellular biology, genetics. And although those do have applications to ecology, the way that these classes were taught, they did not. So that's why I got experience in a lab, and I also took 3 years off to get more experience. So yeah, I don't think people care about your degree as much. And when we hire interns at the museum, we don't care about degree unless it's a weird degree and they like a non-science degree. But if they have experience, that honestly to me is more important. Their references are more important, and just explain why, like, that you changed your mind later on, even though you have this degree. And if you want to go to graduate school, again, make sure that you get the classes you need to get into graduate school. That's really what you need. What opportunities would you recommend a grad student take advantage of during time in school? Again, this is why I'm really advocating my program, because it totally depends on what you want to do. I did not know what I wanted to do. I said I want a job in conservation and outreach. And I didn't know what it looked like. And even this past year, when I was still looking at jobs, I could apply for so many different jobs because my interests were so broad, and I would look at jobs and be like, I like that and I don't like that, but they would never be the same type of job. It was kind of like I recognized what I liked, or I recognized what I didn't like, and then would apply for the things that I liked. But what I found in all the jobs that I applied for is that I interviewed for, somebody else beat me because they had more experience. So in this group, we're really diving into what you like. So if you're in a graduate program and you want to finish, but you really find out that teaching is what you like, or that educating people is what you like to do. So in the Facebook groups the other day, somebody said they wanted to get a master's in herpetology, but they were interested in education careers. I have applied for education careers, like outreach careers at museums and zoos. They don't care if you have a master's degree in science. They care if you have good teaching philosophies, good understanding of how people learn, and that's going to come from education degrees or courses. So you got to figure out exactly what types of careers you're interested in, and then get those, add on those things that will help you be competitive for those jobs. One job I was so perfect for, but it was an executive director position of a nonprofit. The nonprofit was in Central Africa. I did my PhD in Central Africa. I had the passion. I was a good public speaker. I had all these great skills, but I had no experience in fundraising. And perhaps if I volunteered to fundraise with a nonprofit during graduate school or something along those lines, or even just I worked alongside WCS people, even asking if I could somehow like get into working with them on fundraising or taking a fundraising course at my school. Maybe I could have got the job then. So I was good at lots of different things, but I was an expert at some things, but my expertise had very few jobs available to me. So I was constantly trying to fit myself into these jobs. And I was a good candidate. I mean, I got interviews and everything. But like I said, there was just always someone who was better. And everyone emphasizes your network in this field. And in my opinion, my network did not help me. So it will help you in terms of like, if somebody knows someone and they call you up or they call up somebody, the person that they know who knows you, am I explaining this right? They call them up and ask like, how is Stephanie? Is she a good candidate? That will absolutely help you. But I applied for 4 different jobs that I knew people. I worked alongside those people that were on the hiring committee, and I didn't get any of those jobs because I was not the most qualified person. In one of them, somebody spoke Spanish, and this was a diversity position. They spoke Spanish. They had more outreach experience. Another had 10 years of experience on me, so 10 years more of publication, 10 years more of grants. One was actually a lost search or a failed search because it was a social scientist position, and although I had some social science research, I was not formally trained in that. I'm trying to remember what the last one, I don't remember what the last job is, but I actually talk about this in my book coming out this fall. I give you a list of all of the jobs that I applied for, and I explain all the jobs that I interviewed for that I didn't get. So, okay, would a bachelor's in wildlife management be good for research positions, or would I have to get a master's in order to be qualified? I have never looked for permanent positions on the bachelor's level. So it's definitely possible. I do think it's harder, but I'm not quite sure from experience. You might want to check with Christina Lynn. She's at Biologist. She has a permanent job with a bachelor's. But again, I would do the research, use the job tracker, start looking at the jobs you want now, that you ultimately want in your career, and see if they require a master's or not. So Christina, I know she had to get 3 jobs after she graduated until she got her permanent job, 3 temp jobs. And then my friend who graduated in our lab, she graduated with a master's. It took her 3 years before she landed a permanent job. So she also had 3 years of temp jobs. One of those jobs included Starbucks. So it doesn't necessarily mean that you are guaranteed a position when you graduate with your master's. Okay, let's see. I know it's so competitive. It's because that every year there's more and more people graduating, and there's fewer jobs. Even when I was in graduate school, this is when George Bush W was in office, and we thought he was the worst president for the environment. Boy, were we wrong. But during his presidency, we would hear a lot of people retiring from the government and them not keeping the job. They would take the job and then divide the work amongst 2 other people who already existed, sometimes just closing the job permanently. At the museum I just worked for, they had some issues with hiring, and given COVID, they wanted to make sure to hire right away because you never know what's going to happen to that money. With COVID going on, it's a state-funded position, so the state might retract that money. Same thing with universities. I am sure the universities have to cut faculty searches because of funding. So yeah, there's more people out there. Another example I use is that there's this professor at NC State, and he got an assistant professor. I mean, now he's professor, but assistant professor with just one publication. Meanwhile, my friend and I, we were applying for, even though I said I didn't want to go into academia, I did apply for a couple of jobs. We had like 20 publications, and we wouldn't get an interview. Thank you. I'm glad you respect my honesty. And the reason why is I'm being so honest is because I personally feel kind of cheated in my experience, and I have to go in 5 minutes. I'm actually interviewing Christina for my podcast, and I'm interviewing her tonight. And I don't really blame my mentors. I'm not really angry at them. I don't think they realized what was going on. I honestly think the field has changed pretty dramatically pretty recently. I would say within the last 10 years. But just things have become just like so much more competitive, and like I said, jobs are closing. And especially now that I'm pivoting into this new career, I have nothing to lose by telling you guys the truth. Whereas professors, it's awkward for them to tell you because they're not going to be like, don't become a wild... And I'm not saying don't become a wildlife biologist. I'm absolutely not saying that. But it is much more awkward for them to say that because, especially if they have graduate students, because that's how they get graduate students. I actually think a lot of people who want to become wildlife biologists, I laugh at that every time. I know it's unfair. I actually think, based on the emails that people send me, a lot of people don't actually want to become a wildlife biologist. I think they actually want to work in animal rehab or want to be a zookeeper. Because like I said, I didn't really find out what wildlife science was like until I went to graduate school. It is so much about science. So asking questions, analyzing data, and I think more people would be happy in science education positions or, like I said, zookeeper or vet positions. So I don't want to sound negative and be like, don't become a wildlife biologist. This group is all about figuring out your absolute true love and then being competitive for that career. So one of the reasons why I'm not competitive for education careers is, even though I've done a lot of educational programs, or I am competitive, but not as competitive as some people, is because I'm overqualified and I still don't have as much education experience as a lot of people who have education degrees or who have been just in this field longer. So I'm competing against all of those people. So it's more about seeing what the possibilities are, because in graduate school, nobody presented these possibilities to me. It was kind of like, yeah, you could always pivot to science communication, or you could pivot to education, but it's hard. It's really hard to pivot. I remember sitting in this one, okay, I really have to go in a few minutes. I remember sitting in this one class taught by this person. She said, your PhD demonstrates that you have skills, you can problem solve, you are qualified for lots of different jobs. And I think that's true for like if you get plant sciences or more general biology, because you can go into medicine here in the research triangle, you can go into pharmaceuticals, you can go into biotech. But for our field, for wildlife biology, ecology, and conservation, it is really, really, really hard to make that transition. Okay, so I gotta run because I'm gonna talk with Christina. If you have more questions, you can just send me a message and I'll respond to them, or send me an email anyway. But yeah, I encourage you to join the program. There's no risk, so it's $197 for 8 weeks, and you can ask me questions like this every week. If you don't like it, as long as you do all the exercises, I'm having everyone do like worksheets every week. So as long as you do the exercises, but if you don't like it, you don't find it helpful, I'm more than happy to refund your money. And I'd love to have you be a part of it. I hope you join. And yeah, let me know if you have any more questions. Bye.